Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out to what promises to be a fascinating evening. I'd like to introduce David Harris. David Harris is a lawyer with 30 years' experience in national security and intelligence affairs. He is Director of International Intelligence Program of Insignis Strategic Research. David Harris has testified at U.S. Congressional Subcommittee and Canadian Parliamentary Committee hearings, most recently before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. He has served as an intervenor counsel at the Air India Inquiry and Yakabuchi Internal Inquiry, Canadian Terrorism and Intelligence Commissions and Inquiry. Quoted in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and international news services, Mr. Harris has appeared on television's America's Most Wanted, CBS 60 Minutes, NBC Dateline, The Today Show, the CBS News, CNN, and Fox News, including the O'Reilly Factor, Channel News Asia, and BBC Radio and Television. In addition to his law qualification, Mr. Harris holds a Master of Science in Foreign Service degree from Georgetown University, Washington, D.C., and a Master's in Public Administration from Carleton University in Ottawa. He serves on the advisory board of the Mackenzie Institute, a Canadian-based policy research organization focused on terrorism, organized violence, and security. He is also on the advisory board of the Council for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, a Muslim organization dedicated to advancing freedom, social cohesion, and challenging radicalism. So before we start the evening, I would like to ask that everyone turn their phones off. And if you have comments or questions, to please wait until Mr. Harris is finished speaking, and we will entertain them at that time. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Harris.
Now, I'll see if I can organize the microphone so everyone can have at least a chance of hearing. We've tried to adjust the lighting so that you'll be able to have a reasonable view of the slides, and the beneficial side effect is that you won't be able to see me as completely as otherwise. The title of this presentation is Iran, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Domestic Subversion, How International Islamist Trends Threaten the Future of Canadian Jews. I'll try to incorporate some of the more recent developments, of which I'm sure many of us will be aware. Needless to say, this is a fast-changing situation, and my contribution, such as it will be, will amount to the personal opinion of someone on a matter of pressing public interest, and I look forward to hearing your personal opinions once the presentation is over. And I'd like to dedicate my remarks, if the dedication can be the word, to the many genuinely moderate Muslims in Canada and abroad who have done a very great deal for my colleagues and me. Indeed, they are counted among our colleagues in understanding exactly what it is that Canada and the rest of the world face today, and in some respects may be fated, some might say doomed, to face tomorrow. I was saying to someone a while ago that these days, when you see some of the news reports, you begin to wonder whether, as regards events in Canada, we're still in Canada, and whether, as you look around the world, we're actually still in the 21st century. I'm thinking about the idea that one could say quite plausibly that perhaps the most compelling threat we face today could be from a country called Iran. You can see what Iran has contributed in the last few decades, where radicalism, extremism, and outright terrorism has been concerned. We've seen Hezbollah operating around the world. Years ago, all of this was documented to a considerable extent in trials that occurred in Germany, of all places, where the Iranian government had organized the assassination of various dissidents in Germany, but now they're operating, I think, to the tune, when it comes to funding alone, of perhaps $100 million a year, I think it was, in South America, that well-known Shia Islamic area. And this reflects in many ways so many of the demographic trends with which we should now be well and truly familiar, particularly because Canada is among the leaders in some of those trends, including some of the more adverse and, as we'll see, pathological. The changes we've seen, as I noted, get into terrorism where Iran is a concern, but also we have the nuclear question to worry about. And we're seeing the Iranians working very, very hard on missiles that would be more than capable of carrying nuclear warheads. It is estimated that quite possibly some of the rockets they now have might be able to reach areas of southeastern Europe. And well within our anticipation would be the Iranian capacity to strike anywhere in Europe based on some of the research and development they have underway. North America is not by a very long shot an extraordinary hope when it comes to the range of Iranian nuclear missilery. And we know that nuclear weaponry, warheads, are now in development. We have seen the chaotic so-called negotiations underway that, by accounts that astonishingly have never really been contradicted, we've even been treated to what seems to have been the spectacle of at least one formidable Iranian nuclear negotiator screaming and yelling at the Secretary of State of the United States of America. And one might have wondered how on earth we would have reached such a pass. But in its own way, perhaps this is a reflection of the cascading catastrophes that have befallen America and more broadly Western foreign policy in recent years, especially during the Obama administration, but not by any means limited to that administration, as we saw from some of the difficulties that have derived from some of the George W. Bush administration initiatives. Well, where is it all going to lead? In a way, one of the more effective ways, perhaps for me personally, to consider this is to go back to February of 2011. And in that early phase, I was invited to appear before a Canadian Senate committee. I believe this one was looking at immigrant integration. And the relevance of this will become more than obvious in due course. We thought that one way of making our testimony more relevant was to begin by looking at some of the major events that were then unfolding at that instant, events virtually without precedent, certainly in the modern era. And those events were focused on what would emerge as the Arab Spring, or as it's more commonly known in that neck of the woods, the Islamic Awakening. A particular focus of this was, of course, Egypt, and why not? Egypt has been, as you well know, the premier, in many ways, Arab country, but it was also the guarantor of guarantors of peace with Israel, peace such as it has been, as broadly understood in the Middle East, again with respect to Israel in particular. All of that having gone back to the Sadat-Begin Accords years before. So the world had very much a vested interest in ensuring that relations between Israel and Egypt would remain more or less reliable as they had done under the thuggish Egyptian dictator Mubarak. But by early February of 2011, Mubarak was out. And the question was, who would be in? We saw talking heads vigorously comparing notes and being as profound as they could manage on this subject. Some of us thought that, well, I suppose it was obvious that there would be a premium on being able to determine who would indeed replace Mubarak and what the result would be. And this replacement process, everyone anticipated, would be through a democratic vote, by which I mean one person, one vote. I won't say necessarily a small L liberal democratic vote, because as you well know too, that incorporates a number of assumptions about the longevity of the democracy itself and various other associated values. So our basic hypothesis, as we started to look at attitude surveys and trying to anticipate how an election might come out in Egypt, was to suppose that there would be two broad movements arising from any election. On the one hand, you had the prospects of Islamists. And by that, I'm just thinking very generally about what we refer to as fundamentalists, Depending upon the specifics, of course, we may be talking about radicalism, extremism, both in my assumptions non-violent, all the way to outright terrorism. And I'd be happy to discuss with anyone should there be any ambiguity in what I say regarding my use of the term Islamism. And this is to distinguish Islamism from mainstream Islam, just as the term Islamist is to identify fundamentalists of a certain kind from mainstream Muslims. So we came up with this, I thought, fairly obvious hypothesis that you'd have these two main movements. One would feature Muslim Brotherhood types, but also perhaps in association with Salafists and Wahhabis, people generally considered extremely radical. According to their doctrine, you'll recall that Wahhabism is, in its essence, the state religion of Saudi Arabia and other limb-amputating jurisdictions. Allies. And the other side that we anticipated was something more, shall we say, secular, religious. One would have figured in general, moderate Muslims, moderate Islamic tendencies, with some agnostics and atheists and some minorities, such as the Coptic Christians, who constitute roughly 10% of the Egyptian public. Well, how would we go about trying to assess who would take how much of what vote? Well, it was a crude process, but we relied to a considerable degree on Pew opinion surveys that had been undertaken in the 2 years or so before this moment in history. And we came to conclude that the Muslim Brotherhood-friendly parties would generally have the advantage. And this was on the basis, as I say, of these surveys. So what was it about the surveys that suggested that there might be an affinity among the bulk of moderate of Muslim Egyptian voters for at least a Muslim Brotherhood fundamentalist inclination? Well, the surveys, just to give you the tiniest sampling of the kinds of things that we turned up through Pew's own research, the surveys gave us figures like this. In Egypt, 84% of Egyptian Muslims favored death for apostasy. So this means that if you change your religion from Islam, you should be put to death. 82% favored death by stoning for adultery. And bear in mind that I think according to any international lawyer, stoning would quite comfortably meet the definition of torture, and therefore we're essentially talking death by torture. Stoning is a carefully prescribed executional process requiring the launching of initially relatively small stones so as to ensure that the victim not die too early on, perhaps not lose consciousness too early on, so that the suffering level may be maintained until eventual death. And then a far more optimistic figure, for those of us of small L liberal persuasion, only 77% supported whipping and amputations for thievery. 1 in 5 favored Al-Qaeda. Well, given statistics like this, it was perhaps unsurprising then that the Brotherhood, in essence, won in the form of President Morsi. And it was equally unsurprising that around 2010, Egyptian TV had apparently had an interview with Mr. Morsi where he described Jews as apes and pigs. This seems to derive from certain interpretations of the Quran. In a 2010 speech, it emerged that Morsi urged Egyptians to, and I quote, nurse our children and our grandchildren on hatred, unquote, for Jews and Zionists. And when some US politicians met President Morsi and earnestly tried to understand what this was all about, President Morsi claimed he was, and aren't we all, taken out of context. His idea of de-escalation at that time was to add that the whole apes and pigs thing was of course, blown out of proportion by Western media, which was, he said, in certain hands. Over the last decade, Canada has brought approximately 20,000 people in as immigrants from Egypt. And I trust that most of those people have come to Canada because they want to get away from precisely this kind of thing. We know that certainly Christian Copts have very much that tendency. But I would also be extraordinarily naive to imagine that everyone in a number as big as 20,000 is perhaps entirely philosophically removed from President Morsi. But there were other things that were interesting in those Pew surveys that take us somewhat farther afield than Egypt. 34% of Jordanians, and of course we're often, I think, reasonably correctly reminded that Jordan tends to be a relatively moderate country among members of that neighborhood. 34% of Jordanians, and almost half Nigeria's Muslims favored Al-Qaeda. And there's Hezbollah, which of course is the monstrous creation of the Iranian terror regime. Hezbollah has had a presence in Canada at least since the mid-1990s, and I very much remember being at a hearing at Parliament, just in the audience, and was sharing some time with some very moderate liberal democratic Lebanese who were pointing out to me, this must have been about 2006 after the Israel-Hezbollah war, a Hezbollah member or two in the audience, having witnessed presentations in our House of the People by, in that case, a Crown Minister and some other folk as well. It sort of brings it home, doesn't it? So Hezbollah, 54% of Jordanian Muslims favor it, like 92% of Lebanese Shia Muslims, like 40% of Indonesian Muslims. And again, the relevance to Canada will become clearer, but just perhaps to whet your appetite, I can't help but think back to that year, 2006, when Canada was called upon to rescue tens and tens and tens of thousands of people who had Canadian citizenship but were living in Lebanon, a good many of them in the southern areas which were, as they discreetly say, frequented by Hezbollah. What is the relevance of all of this? How does it bear on Canada? Well, I guess as some of those fairly chintzy ads for our openness might suggest, we are the world. And that means all kinds of good things. But an incomplete understanding of precisely what it does mean and will mean will not help us very much. We take in, and I don't know how many of you know how many people we greet as immigrants each year, but it might be worth testing yourselves. Most people, frankly, don't have a clue, because it's not something we tend to worry about, and we're reassured constantly by representatives of each and every main federal political party, and I dare say every other party right down to city levels, with an eye to votes and importing votes, that there's nothing much to see here on this subject. But the number, this country of about 35 million population brings in almost 300,000 people per year. But if you include so-called temporary visa holders, you're at well over 500,000 people per year. So if you've ever had that sense that your country is changing around you as it never seemed to have been 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago, there's a reason for this. And if you find that there are issues now arising in your not country anymore, or city, or neighborhood, I promise you they will. This is one of those reasons. In fact, maybe for some people this is an introduction to your future. There are all kinds of questions that arise, of course, when you have, well, we don't have immigration. We have mass immigration, and that's very important to get straight. The numbers we're dealing with in per capita terms are so, and I measure my words, it's not hyperbole, gigantic per capita. In per capita terms, these are gigantic. I think we did a calculation that it was, how concerned the Americans are about their security in relation to certain immigration trends and border issues. I believe we're at about 2.5 times per capita the immigration intake. Well, this all may start to explain, too, why about 15 years ago we began to see things that we wouldn't have necessarily associated with Canada. Why today you can go through relatively immense lists when it comes to Islamic extremism, among any number of other extremisms, among any number of other threats that are related to the movement of people. And this can involve aggressive foreign intelligence operations, of course, needless to say, involving Iran, but also countries like China, countries like Russia, with aggressive foreign intelligence organizations. And it becomes highly relevant whenever you are dealing with totalitarian or authoritarian jurisdictions. Why? Because if you were importing people by the tens of thousands, I think we receive some years from China about 30,000 people in a given year. If you're bringing people in from that jurisdiction, you can assume, and not unreasonably, that every last individual among that intake will be coming because they've had a dream to come here, they are determined to be loyal and reliable in the service of this country. But one of the tragedies we face in today's world, and the reality of politics and paramilitary activity and foreign intelligence operations, is that it's very often not really up to newcomers, but they ultimately may wind up being constrained to do. And let me give you an example. If, for example, you've come from a country where you have family remaining behind, or business interests, that can be a source of pressure and extortion. How do you handle that? In a normal kind of way, once you become a Canadian, maybe before that you'd be entitled to find your way into all sectors of this country's life and economy. You could be in the federal government. You might find your way into security-sensitive areas. Many areas are more security-sensitive than we'd ever imagine. You could be in private industry, and there can all be all kinds of possible issues of vulnerability and so on. When it comes to the question of Canadian Muslims, as we know, they have, in the main, been more than reliable and loyal. I work with so many of them, and they have fought heroically in defense of our values and to try to identify radicals and extremists. But there are problems, and Muslims will generally tell you this straightforwardly, but our news, of course, has signaled to us a great deal of this. Some of them talk about a struggle for the soul of Islam internationally, and that is to some extent reflected in the violence that we now see increasingly around the world. But here in Canada, there was in 2007 an interesting poll. This was put together by Environics. It found at the time that 9 out of 10 Canadian Muslims were born abroad. So there you had complex issues right away, including jurisdictions from which people come, having to do with the kinds of values that may be inculcated in different people in different countries. How religion might be conveyed and taught in some jurisdictions, for example. I've talked about Iran, but as we've seen in the outcome in Iraq and Syria, of course things could be very complicated on any number of levels. The 2007 Environics poll found that I think about 10 or 12% of Canadian Muslims could have justified the Toronto or a Toronto 18 type of plot. You may remember the Toronto 18 plot as alleged. It seemed to call for mass casualty attacks, initially in Toronto, attacks on the regional Canadian Security Intelligence Service headquarters, attack on the main CBC facility. I think there may have been a dream of bringing down a skyscraper in Toronto. And then there was to be Ottawa, where the Parliament buildings were to be invaded and the Prime Minister to be beheaded. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're sensible, highly sophisticated, intelligent people, and you know better, as we all did a year or so ago. You know there's no way anybody could ever break into the Parliament building. It would be too absurd, right? Because we have minimally competent infrastructure in that kind of regard. So there may be a lesson for us. Now, what exactly does it mean to say that a group of people could justify this? Well, that is an ambiguity, and it would have to be sorted out. But it is a source of some concern. And to what extent might more people, in this case, we're talking about Canadian Muslims, be inclined to be drawn into this kind of extremism? It's difficult to say. It's one of those uncertainties. But it is worth reflecting that if we're claiming, as that study seemed to, that 10 or 12% of Canadian Muslims could justify those kinds of attacks, bear in mind that if you do the arithmetic, that appears to be saying that between 49,000 and 119,000 of your fellow Canadians might be able to justify what I have just described. There are questions that relate to many aspects of the conditioning of Canadian Muslims, and in whose hands those who may even have been born and bred here might develop. This becomes more and more relevant, of course, to us as we see more and more people heading off to join organizations like ISIS, the so-called Islamic State. And it's very important to remember what we're saying when we talk about people going off to join the Islamic State. I dare say there are all kinds of refinements of reasons for doing this, but I don't think we would be unfair to summarize by saying that this means joining an organization that has been enthusiastically involved in mass murder, in maiming, in torture, in sex slavery, in rape, and so on. And that should focus a few of our minds, especially at a time when parliamentary committees have repeatedly been hearing not merely concerns from police about how they're having to move major resources now, because they are, my words, being overwhelmed by the terror threat, as we saw this also occurring in certain other jurisdictions, including Britain. We just heard about 600 largely specialized officers of the RCMP are now being moved to deal with the terrorism threat. Will there be another 600 available in 6 months or 3 years when we find that terrorism threat, which is clearly metastasizing by any reasonable assessment, has grown further? Well, in this, of course, we're looking at the origins, the propagating of at least some of the radicalism and extremism. So when it came to that Senate committee testimony in 2011, I raised the case of the Muslim Association of Canada, MAC. MAC is considered by many, I think, to be a leading educator of young Canadian Muslims, including in this city. And I'm sure MAC has brought a number of very positive traits to bear on its responsibilities. It owns a number of schools. According to a recent report, it's starting to buy up a considerable amount of property. But one of the things that I found puzzling and at times troubling was that a few years ago, I found on the MAC website a statement about the fundamentals of the way in which they viewed their faith. And here is what that website said. MAC's roots are deeply enshrined in the message of Prophet Muhammad. Its modern roots can be traced to the Islamic revival of the early 20th century, culminating in the movement of the Muslim Brotherhood. This movement influenced Islamic activities, trends, and intellectual discourse throughout the world, including those of Muslims who came to Canada in search of freedom, education, and better opportunities. Mac adopts and strives to implement Islam as embodied in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet, and as understood in its contemporary context by the late Imam Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Mac regards this ideology as the best representation of Islam as delivered by Prophet Muhammad. So this caused me and many other people to reflect. The Muslim Brotherhood's motto is this: Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, Jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. In 1991, a document was produced that wound up being adduced in evidence in the biggest terror funding trial in U.S. history, the U.S. Holy Land Foundation trial. This was a notably successful prosecution. It led to revelations about intelligence that prior to 9/11 had simply not been admissible, or at least not been shareable is probably a more accurate way of putting it, between the intelligence arms of the FBI and the law enforcement side, and therefore wouldn't have been available, generally speaking, for prosecutions. 9/11 changed this. And the document that was produced in 1991 that was adduced in evidence was a strategic memorandum. And this strategic memorandum was a Muslim Brotherhood document that laid out, in effect, the future plans of the Brotherhood for Canada and the United States. It was referred to as the strategic memorandum. Among other things, it prescribed for the Ikhwan, the Muslim brothers, the Brotherhood, their duties in coming to North America. Now, you and I, of course, have very much, in our generation, learned, not unreasonably, to be ashamed of many elements of Western colonization and imperialism. I think we've tended to take that to heart. It goes to issues of supremacism, illiberalism, intolerance, and so on. But there's something perversely refreshing about a people, apparently the Muslim Brotherhood, are prepared to speak very straightforwardly and openly about their duty in coming to a dark, primitive land that essentially has nothing whatever to offer in values terms. And it was this document that was presented to the court that I've just described. And here is how it describes the duties of the Muslim Brothers in coming to Canada and the United States. Quotes, "The process of settlement," so that's in the sense of colonization, "is a civilization jihadist process with all the word means. The Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, must understand that their work in America is kind of a grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house." So then, of course, one reflects on our future as seen through the eyes of the brothers who were frequently described as people with whom, at least by the Obama administration, we can do business, even if we don't have to like them. And of course, I can't help but ask myself what the view of the Muslim Association of Canada and its running of its several or many schools in Canada is of this kind of mandate, in light of what the Muslim Association of Canada appears to have said about regarding the approach of the Muslim Brotherhood as the authoritative interpretation of Islam. But these are confusing days. The Muslim Association of Canada has been involved recently in a controversy, one that saw at least one newspaper and I think some testimony before parliamentary committees, suggesting that the Muslim Association of Canada may have contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to Irfan Canada, an organization that was later listed by the Government of Canada as a terrorist entity and was said, the latter organization, Irfan Canada, to have provided money to Hamas, a designated terror organization. Now, in defense of the Muslim Association of Canada, it must be pointed out that their contribution, as alleged, to Irfan Canada occurred before Irfan Canada was listed as a terrorist organization. The complication for the rest of us in understanding the ramifications of things like this is, of course, that not all organizations that might ultimately be found to be terrorist organizations by a court are necessarily listed. And so we all have a certain due diligence obligation to try to determine which organizations that are the beneficiaries of our largesse are reliable. But these are the kinds of questions now that we must ask. And as we find Muslims coming in enormous numbers, you may remember that former immigration minister and now Harper Lieutenant JCC was boasting only a while ago, I think, that in the course of this government's governance, the Harper government has brought in 300,000 Muslims. And I'm sure this could be all to the good, but as I noted, we are living in a fraught world, and we're finding politicians of all parties desperately eager to increase immigration intake, contrary to our fundamental economic interests, something that will seem surprising news to those of you who so constantly hear the drumbeat of statements by all of the political parties about how desperately we need the kinds of numbers we're bringing in. Immigration economists, by the way, seem to suggest we need a few tens of thousands of people per year, not close to 300,000, or with temporary visa holders over 500,000. But be all of that as it may, back to these numbers. In 1981, there were about 98,000 Muslims in Canada. By 2031, about 15 years from now, I think some projections suggest 2.9 million. To give you a sense relative to the Jewish population and some of the implications regarding foreign policy, to say the very least, the core Jewish population in Canada is said to be about 380,000. A broader definition might give you 500,000 Jews in Canada. Between 1981 and 2031, according to government projections, or projections based on government figures, we'll have seen an increase in the Canadian Muslim population of 2,900%. This will mean that we will have gone from a situation in which in 1981, Jews outnumbered Muslims in Canada about 2 to 1. In 2031, Muslims will outnumber Jews almost 7 to 1, and one can expect, on the basis of a few probably fairly reasonable assumptions, our domestic and especially foreign policy, especially in relation to Israel, to follow suit. Indeed, one wonders, against a deteriorating security situation, whether it would be at all reasonable to imagine that within the rather foreseeable future, it will be safe to engage in Israel advocacy. What are some of the manifestations that we've seen, the kinds of difficulties we might be concerned about, and that Jewish Canadians in particular might be concerned about? Well, there was a fuss a few years ago involving the Toronto District School Board. An Islamic school was allowed to operate under a permit from that local school board. There were concerns about the curriculum from the National Post. The school's curriculum, which it has now taken off its website, referred to crafty, treacherous Jews, and contrasted Islam with, quotes, the Jews and the Nazis. The passages were from 2 books published by Iranian foundations. The booklets also told children, said the National Post, that Islam was the best religion, and provided a list of, quotes, unclean things, including pigs, dogs, and, quotes, a person who does not believe in Allah. This, incidentally, is entirely consistent with some of the notes to the Qurans produced by the Saudis and available in Canada Those who rejoice in this kind of material would enjoy some of the footnotes to 928 of the Saudi Quran, which talks in general terms about how non-Muslims are filthy, was the word that was used by scholars, in spirit and blood. But according to the National Post, the booklets went on to say that boys should be, quotes, healthy and strong, unquotes, so that they would be, quotes, ready for jihad whenever the time comes for it, unquotes. Girls, meanwhile, were told to limit their involvement in physical activities and to instead engage in hobbies that would prepare them to become mothers and wives. Well, we've had our own little experience in Ottawa with something like this. There are any number of these kinds of episodes that have emerged over recent years, generally tracked with immigrant movements from some countries that have fairly hardline Islamic elements in them. One situation involved the Lady Evelyn School in Ottawa. This is an entity of the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, and as in so many cases, it was thanks to Canadians of Muslim, and in this case Iranian background, that we learned about this situation, and they entrusted me with some of the information that enabled us to publicize what was going on. It also revealed involvement in the situation of the Iranian embassy, which was, of course, existing in Ottawa, and that certain parents of children connected to the Iranian program, a weekend program that was put on at the Lady Evelyn School, seemed to be heavily involved in fundamentalism. Well, what we discovered, among other things, was that the texts that were being used in relevant classes, Farsi, Iranian culture, were produced by the Ministry of Education. And of course, this is unsurprising, except it was the Ministry of Education of Iran. And one of the things, I'll share this with you, and I hope you'll be able to see some of the information up top here. This, of course, is a listing of immigrant intake, and we've already been over the relevant detail. This is one of the textbooks suitable for grade 3 children in Ottawa, getting ready to celebrate their diversity in this rainbow coalition of ethnocultural and religious groupings. The grade 3 Iranian text glorified child soldiery and suicide martyrdom operations, as grade 3 texts will tend to. It celebrated, among other things, a 13-year-old child soldier and accomplished suicide bomber. He appears before you from the text. The children could read, the Ottawa children could read how this boy tied a grenade to his belt and threw himself under an enemy tank. This was during the Iran-Iraq War, and if you look carefully in the background, you can just make out the boy throwing himself under the tank. One picture I found interesting. Again, I do hope you can at least make out a little of that. This picture goes with a fictional story that was in another of these textbooks. You can see that it shows a bunch of ogre-like creatures in olive drab. They have brown skin, but the features somehow don't quite seem to suggest anything in particular that's especially human. They're surrounding a precious, demure little female creature, pinkish skin, innocence personified. And it took me a second to register that I was looking at a portrayal of Israeli soldiers. And the ogre-like aspect struck me, at least, as being reminiscent of the very well-known apes and pigs theme. So here you had these ogre-type characters, and the little girl was supposed to be a Palestinian who was, of course, being abused by Israeli soldiers. The text, again, for grade 3s, was about a 6-year-old Khaled, a Palestinian child who was teaching his 3-year-old brother Muhammad to stone Israeli soldiers. And just an exciting quotation, From the story, the Israeli officer hit Mohammed's head with his gun stock and his warm blood splashed over Habed's hands. Unquotes. Also, from one of these texts, I don't know if you recognize the lead character in this. I gather the caption said something like the kind imam. And of course he's hugging or cuddling a young boy. The kind imam is the Ayatollah Khomeini, at whose hands so many thousands perished. Torture chambers, hunting Baha'is, and of course it would seem wanting to destroy Israel and Jews. Pretty good instruction for a Saturday morning. Well, I published a story, again thanks to Iranian Canadians, in the Huffington Post with these images. You can see them, Huffington Post Canada. And not much came of it, to be perfectly honest. The Ottawa Carleton District School Board came out with a pat response. Never seemed to be a suggestion that anybody might be fired, that there might be a serious investigation. And for those interested in intelligence, the issue of penetrating our educational infrastructure was certainly a reasonable enough one might have thought, given the specific reports of some very heroic Iranian Canadian parents. But other things have emerged, and just to give you a little touch, we have a Libyan school in Calgary. News of this emerged. This was originally from Blazing Cat Fur, a website that seems to have been able to discover this. This is a section in the syllabus of a Calgary school, and one of its headings is "And purge the city of the treachery of the Jews," unquote. There were also problems, some of you may recall, in 2005, involving the Abrar School, which is today a Muslim Association of Canada school. Now, the Abrar School had a fuss that developed. It came to the attention of a journalist of the Ottawa Citizen that there was something on display in this school, an artwork, an assignment, I think it was described as, that concerned people, and someone who was identified as a representative of the Ottawa Jewish Community Council responded to it by saying, "My reaction was shock and dismay. The principal of Abrar was right to suspend the teachers, but here's my question. The story, this is a story of fiction written by a student under close supervision, it appears, of possibly 2 faculty of the Abrar School at the time. The story was written in Arabic and then displayed. The principal doesn't speak Arabic, but did she not see his drawing on it? The machine gun, the Star of David in flames, the Palestinian flag, did she not notice it? And if she did, why didn't it arouse her suspicion? Why didn't she do something about it?" That was as recorded by the late Earl McCrae, a columnist in Ottawa. That was what was on display. And you can see the Palestinian flag, no crime there. But one becomes a bit more curious when dealing with somebody who couldn't have been more than grade 8, with what appears to be a good rendering of an AK-47. And you may be able to make out the burning Magen David, Star of David. Well, the child had a storytelling assignment. And some of the material that emerged from that, I'm just quoting a translation that the Ottawa Citizen put together in an article by Juliette O'Neill. "Without thinking, Ahmed took his M16 machine gun and threw the bombs, and he showered the Jews, presumably with the munitions. This resulted in the killing of the soldiers. Salah, an associate, it seems, of Ahmed, said, 'You killed them all.' Ahmed answered, 'Please be to God.' And then finally, we promise God and the heroes of Al-Aqsa," I believe you see the Al-Aqsa Mosque there, "that we will continue the path. We will continue in spite of the difficulties and the hardships until the victory or the martyrdom. We will not surrender, we will fight for the sake of God until the end, done with our thanks to God. God bless you. Your efforts are good, the teacher wrote on the title page. This again from newspaper coverage. The teacher wrote, the story of the hero Ahmed and the hero Salah is still alive. The end will be soon, when God unites us all in Jerusalem to pray there. The principal of that school, as far as I know, a reputable individual, has periodically, I think, been embraced for the purposes of outreach by the RCMP and the Ottawa Police Services. She played a part in suspending the two teachers. The difficulty is, of course, we don't really know what became of these teachers. Are they back again? Was there any kind of the sensitivity training that seems to be so much in vogue for, shall we say, the rest of us, when or if we should err? Well, demographics is destiny. And as I was saying, the federal parties are squabbling over how many more people we can bring into the country and how fast. And this gets complicated, as I was indicating earlier, because you will find that people who come into the country with whatever training, whatever mindset they bring, will wind up in government, in police, in security services, in emergency services. They'll be making decisions about whether your children and grandchildren get that job, get into that university or college program. It sounds sort of familiar, I think, to many people in the Jewish community, perhaps, for some of the prospects. The Ottawa police have been causing a bit of concern now and then in relation to some of their outreach initiatives, but frankly they reflect a bit of a trend we're seeing across the country, and especially in some of the metropolitan areas. Let me give you an example. In 2012, the end of Ramadan came, and in the usual way, of course, there were end of Ramadan dinners. And to the end of Ramadan in 2012, in August, I guess it was, that time, the senior police officers, possibly including members of the Police Services Board, maybe, I dare say, including some city councillors, but racing around to 3 mosques in Ottawa to help celebrate this event. This is part of outreach. I was leaving the country, I think, the day this fact that this was going to take place became public. And so I only had time to do the following. I put the name and address of the first mosque to which the police were scheduled to visit into the internet. That was the extent of the intelligence search I had time for. That was on the homepage of the mosque that came up. Now, most people won't find that this means a great deal to them, but I can tell you that I recoiled because this was a leftover poster from an event that had occurred several weeks earlier. In other words, several weeks before, the most senior people of the Ottawa Police Force were going to visit this mosque and implicitly confer legitimacy upon the mosque, one presumes the executive of the mosque, and so on and so forth. We haven't got much time to go into Sheikh Bilal Phillips, but suffice to say that well before the event he attended, he had been banned and deported on national security grounds from multiple countries, including, just off the top, Kenya and Germany. He will fairly candidly explain to you why gays must be put to death in Muslim lands. And he has several other views that might be considered, how you say, controversial. I could see this, but apparently this didn't put off some people holding some of the most sensitive offices in the city of Ottawa. That's problematic. It reminds me of some other failings that have occurred. We saw in 2010 the huge embarrassment faced by, I guess it was the Minister of Justice of the time, when the RCMP, with some kind of round table that it had welcoming representatives of the community at large, sent out, forwarded, an invitation to a peace conference. What could go wrong? An invitation to a peace conference that was being put on, I think sponsored, at least nominally, by 4 dissident or quasi-dissident members of the Green Party. There was a controversial imam who was originally slated to have been a co-chair. An individual, originally it is said from Iran, provided an invitation, a poster, 1 or 2 other things, to the uniformed officer, the RCMP, who operated as the secretary of this committee. The officers sent around this invitation with an enthusiastic annotation saying, "We want to see you all there." It went far and wide. Eventually, Maclean's picked this up. It's amazing how this is sort of lost to our memory, but it's been a fairly constant diet of things, frankly. And when you look through the agenda of this event, did I mention it was at the Government Conference Centre? Silly me. When you looked at the agenda of the event, what you noticed was that it might have looked to an intelligence specialist like a reflection of an Iranian strategic intelligence deception operation. It had all kinds of Iranian government-friendly themes. There was one memorable element where you had a representative of a peace organization. I gather it was an Iranian peace organization, but unlike some of the brand-name peace organizations we encountered, you found, if you went to the relevant link to the website of this peace organization, a cartoon that appeared to show a hook-nosed Jew with a top hat made of skulls. And this was what the RCMP was advertising as an invitation. But when a number of people finally made a fuss about this, the Justice Minister, or Solicitor General, felt constrained to ultimately publicly order the RCMP not to go to meetings of hate groups. And I understand that on occasion the RCMP would have to, undercover, of course, do these things, but that was not what was in contemplation originally. And then it emerged, when outsiders did the homework, that individuals, the individual who had been on this liaison committee, originally from Iran, had been running some kind of cultural center. And by an astonishing coincidence, the cultural center's address happened to have been one and the same as that of the Iranian embassy. There are issues of due diligence that are very compelling, and it is very much now up to us, as we see the pressure of demographics tempting people and organizations, even security organizations, to begin liaising with entities and individuals who 20 years ago wouldn't have got a look in. But this is where we have, frankly, as a public, failed hideously in our responsibilities as citizens and as parents and as grandparents, because we've allowed this to happen. We've allowed a very, very dangerous situation to begin, what I'm describing as the merest of beginnings, to unfold. As for the Ottawa police, if you speak privately to some of those people, and by this, incidentally, I'm not by any means, so let us indulge in stereotypes, talking about old school, hoary old guys who are so tough-minded they might lack all kinds of sensitivity. I'm talking to relatively young, sensitive, sensible people, many of whom actually are minorities. And they've expressed to me concern that they no longer feel, based on the recruitment processes they've seen, that they can be fully confident that some of their colleagues might, as one put it, have their backs should certain public order problems arise. Did I mention that in connection with the Bilal Phillips poster I've shown you. The Ottawa police may well have had recruiting tables with them at that mosque. And certainly later on, whether they had recruiting tables at that end of Ramadan dinner, within a year, they did go and they did recruit from that mosque. Now, there may be some good news. I've since heard that the mosque has since changed its management and perhaps other things, in which case it might be extremely helpful if such entities were to come out, and here are the key words, to condemn publicly and by name the individuals such as Bilal Phillips, who seem to have propagated the kinds of worldviews that we've seen. That would be very helpful in a context where radicalization is a concern. And here is a further example of the kind of difficulty that we can all get into, and that we as Canadians can introduce the rest of the world to through very poor outreach and due diligence. In late September, there was produced something that was called United Against Terrorism. This was advertised as a counter-radicalization handbook at a time when the premier concern, a key concern of everyone, is to avoid the kinds of radicalization that we've seen and proved so damaging in this country and elsewhere. It is thought that we have ourselves been responsible as a country for exporting perhaps hundreds of people to join the ranks of IS with all the horrors that that implies. But we have also noted that for certain, according to authorities, 80 people who had gone abroad to serve with terrorist organizations in different capacities have returned. And the reliable analysis, in my respectful opinion, is that probably that figure is closer to 200. And we know the possibilities from last October, attending at least the idea of having ideological extremists in one's midst. So out came this United Against Terrorism handbook. This seemed like the answer to the proverbial maiden's prayer. But it emerged that the handbook had been produced collaboratively by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and the Islamic Social Services Association. The National Council of Canadian Muslims began life as something called CARE-CAN, the Canadian Council on American Islamic Relations. CARE-CAN was the Canadian chapter of an American organization, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. And CARE eventually came to be designated an unindicted co-conspirator in that largest terror funding trial in U.S. history. The U.S. mother organization had seen several of its members, senior officials and affiliates, sentenced to prison on pleas of guilt in terrorism-related matters. So one does wonder about the appropriateness of certain kinds of outreach. Well, this book came out, and it made some useful suggestions, I dare say, but it provided some guidance about the identities of some of the religious authorities who might reliably be sought out, relied upon by those who might be concerned about radicalization problems. And of course, one of the most significant audiences for this would unavoidably have been parents concerned about their own children with regard to radicalization. Well, you can imagine the astonishment of those who had done any kind of serious reading about radicalization in North America to find that among the list of recommended imams and other advisors were some of the most radical Islamists on the North American continent. I still find myself surprised by this. One was Siraj Wahaj. He was an imam whose name wound up on a list of unindicted co-conspirators in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He has been condemned roundly for having said certain things that have convinced many people that he has been quite radical. He's had some honors, such as being able to, I think, address or say prayers at some legislatures here and there. But there is great ambiguity. There was Dr. Jamal Badawi, Professor Emeritus, St. Mary's University, originally from Egypt. He was an unindicted co-conspirator himself. He was on the Majlis, or executive of the Islamic Society of North America, an organization designated an unindicted co-conspirator, and the unindicted co-conspirator status of which had been upheld in U.S. court. A U.S. District Court said there was, quotes, ample evidence, unquotes, of an association of the Islamic Society of North America with Hamas and certain other extremist organizations. Well, today, this handbook with the RCMP's name on it is working its way around the world. And we are, implicitly as a result of that, commending certain Islamist religious teachers and advisors as reliable in the war against Islamism. The RCMP, the day after the document was released, did, in fairness, come out with a press release that said that shortly before the release, the publication of this handbook, they had withdrawn from the project. They said on the grounds that there were certain adversarial elements that they didn't fancy in parts of the document. But they never came out and condemned the document, or at least insisted on the removing of their name and logo from this document. There is some nominal statement in the document about how those contributing to the document are responsible only for the parts they contributed. But this is very concerning. I gather that, according to some testimony that's out there from a parliamentary committee, the document's being sent to parts of Africa to help out. So presumably this will be further advertising for at least some Islamist thinkers who may not quite warrant that advertising. Well, to what extent in all of this can we rely upon our governments to look after this solution, including, as part of the necessary solution, I would submit, a radical reduction in immigration intake until we have a stabilized situation where we can all interact with one another and live in peace. We have had moderate Muslims demanding, moderate Muslim immigrants demanding reductions in immigration from some of their own homeland countries. I can think of a great example of Mrs. Rahil Raza, who's president of the organization on whose advisory board I sit. And I hasten to add, I'm not authorized to speak for the organization, but she has said publicly, indeed she challenged Mr. Jason Kenney, when he was immigration minister, to impose a moratorium on immigrants from Pakistan, her own home country. I believe on the grounds that the radicalization, the cauldron of radicalization we're seeing in Pakistan might better not be imported for the time being into Canada, given the problems we're already condemned to face. Tariq Fatah, also from Pakistan, made an identical recommendation. Ms. Raza expanded hers, saying that this should also apply to other terror-producing countries. I think she mentioned Somalia. So how much can we rely on our politicians to help us in this? Difficult to say, but let me give you an example of the situation in the United States. I don't know if you can read this, but this is an attempt to illustrate some of the absurdity that political correctness and political correctness and the disinclination to deal straightforwardly with serious, no, it's absurd, that is an understatement, with the gravest possible of problems facing life and limb, problems facing national security and public safety. What we found is on top of misguided outrage, a terrible self-censorship, where we do not identify the enemy as, for example, extremist Islamism, Islamic terrorism. There are other enemies besides, and we have to identify those. White supremacism is something of real concern to a number of us. But for the moment, we're talking about Islamist trends. And this shows you a kind of censorship that's been going on. In 2004, there finally emerged the 9/11 report in the United States, looking at that disaster on 9/11. And a retired major of the US Army Reserve, Stephen Coughlin, a lawyer by training, put together what's called a frequency analysis. He, in essence, was working out the number of uses of certain terms in various US government publications. So in 2004, you can see on the left column the words, certain select words that were used and the number of times that they were used. The word Islam was used 322 times, Muslim 145 times, Jihad 126 times, and so on. This might have been roughly what you might have expected when, by 2004, it was recognized that this was an Islamic extremist attack on the United States and the West. Hardly a surprise. In 2008, out came the FBI counterterrorism lexicon. In all fairness, the lexicon is a far shorter document. But in all fairness, one would think that a lexicon would be rather to the point when it comes to advising members of the FBI, especially FBI counterintelligence, especially FBI counterterrorism, what the challenge is, what the reality is of the enemy they will be facing in their streets and abroad, depending upon the kind of FBI liaison they're doing. So you have violent extremism, the word of the day. Enemy not used once, jihad not once, Muslim not once, Islam not once. On it goes. Muslim Brotherhood 0. Hamas 0, of course. Hezbollah 0, of course. Al-Qaeda from 36 uses in the 9/11 report to 0. How is the kid, as the kids would say, do you do that? But we're not finished. This is the US government intelligence strategy for 2009. Violent extremism 9. All those words I described, gone. Al-Qaeda was used once. And then, I don't know if this rings a bell. This was the Fort Hood shooting. When you had a wild Presbyterian screaming Allahu Akbar as he shot down all of these people. And recall that this was a blue ribbon panel of the US government that did this analysis, and some might say was rendered incapable of telling the truth in plain English. This fellow, Major Hassan, had a card. His business card said Soldier of Allah. He went on at length about why he had to do this on religious orders and so on and so on. But this is the kind of difficulty we're facing. We've been doing the same thing in Canada. About 3 years ago, we had the first national terrorist report, public report. The whole idea of this is to situate citizens in reality. Because nothing I've said to you, frankly, should be particular news. But it likely will be because, of course, we don't have a lot of this information as readily available as it should be. So about 3 years ago, you had the first version of this report. And its English version used reasonable English. It identified a dominant threat as, I think I'm quoting, Sunni Islamist extremism. And it probably, I don't recall, described and identified in similar terms any number of other threats. But by last year, when the 2014 report, the latest one, came out, all that language had been purged Not some of it, not a lot of it, not much of it, all of it. And the only exception was where the writers of this thing had been dragged kicking and screaming, having unavoidably to refer to a specific terrorist organization that happened to incorporate the word Islamic. But there'd be no talk about Islamic extremism, Islamic terrorism. And so for your viewing pleasure, I'm going to show you a paragraph reflecting merely one aspect of this purging. And it involves the purging, among other things, talk about those people who travel abroad for what we might describe as terrorist purposes. And to have people understand the threats they'll be facing, you should be logically identifying the nature of those people traveling. So you understand, are they going to join ISIS? Are they going to join Sikh extremist organizations in India, which then sets up a whole different raft of issues, political and security terms, and solutions? Are they white Euro supremacists? Are they Christian terrorists? Are they Jewish terrorists? You have to know, because you have vastly different policy solutions, vastly different ways in which you've got to prepare your people, educate your own people in police forces, in security, in the military. Otherwise, you're not really having much of a hope of preparing your own forces to deal with the combatant doctrine, the aims and so on, of the enemy. So just as regards the narrow issue of how you handle the language of people traveling abroad for terrorist purposes, here is an excerpt of one paragraph, exactly as it appeared in the 2014 federal government report. I've highlighted the red portion that will be of interest. Europol estimates that between 1,200 and 2,000 European extremist travelers took part in the conflict in Syria in 2013. There appears to be an increase in extremist travelers. This suggests that the threat posed to Europe by returning extremist travelers may be more significant than the threat facing North America, because greater numbers of extremist travelers are leaving, then returning to Europe, then are leaving and later returning to North America. This difference between Canada and Europe in numbers of extremist travelers can be attributed to a variety of factors. Regardless, Europe and Canada face a common interconnected threat from, guess who? Extremist travelers. What on earth have we done to ourselves? And one reason why we've done this to ourselves is that through outreach to precisely the wrong individuals and groups, we've been getting advice to purge all references of this kind. This is what's happened with the Obama administration. We hung on far better than the Obama administration had in the face of these kinds of recommendations. But now we've had, in at least some outreach, a warrant for self-confusion. This is not how you survive a war, much less fight a war that is being imposed upon you. So what about Canada? Can we look to our government representatives for assistance? I might not be terribly hopeful that there would be much self-generated assistance coming to us from parties. I'll just talk about the federal parties for the moment. The Harper government has just come out to say that they're the party of immigration. Before, of course, it had been the Liberals that had mastered that particular racket. And of course, we're bringing in, I think it was rather resisted in all fairness by the Harper government, thousands and thousands and thousands of people from the Syria-Iraq front. They're going to be voters, eventually, one presumes. What are the implications of that? What about the opposition parties? I can't help but go back to a conference that I think took place at the end of 2012 called Reviving the Islamic Spirit. This is an Islamic conference. It's seen some of the most radical people around and about who've appeared before it. I think it's been going for about 12 years. And I wrote this as a way of trying to warn off Mr. Justin Trudeau, who was slated to be the keynote speaker, something that astonished most of us. The conference was initially sponsored by Irfan Canada, which was just itself listed as a terrorist entity. These things happen, I guess. And to look at the list of some of those who were speakers at this conference is something quite amazing. There was our friend Sheikh Bilal Phillips. There had been an invitation to the 2004 conference to a fellow by the name of Al Sudais, who was a very significant Saudi religious leader, who so memorably said, quote, "Jews of yesterday are the evil forefathers of the even more evil Jews of today, infidels, prophet murderers, the scum of the human race, accursed by Allah, who turn them into apes and pigs, just the kind of person you want to have at a conference of this kind, especially where some emphasis on youth tends to be the case." He kindly added, talking about Jews, an ongoing continuum of deceit, obstinacy, licentiousness, evil, and corruption, too. Christians were merely idolaters, worshippers of the cross, and then there were the hideous idol-worshipping Hindus mentioned. This is bridge building, baby. The RIS, the Reviving Islamic Spirit Conference invitee, was in India in 2010. An Indian physician preacher, Zakir Naik. Now, Zakir Naik has just won a £130 award from the King of Saudi Arabia, which was somewhat controversial outside Saudi Arabia because Dr. Naik had provided religious justification for sex slavery, which is not considered fashionable in these IS days with many of us. Naik also had the position on suicide bombing that it should be done under proper guidance. So I suppose he was not wholly irresponsible. There was Sheikh Riyad ul-Haq, who spoke at the Reviving the Islamic Spirit Convention in Toronto. And he said, I guess paraphrasing a Quranic passage, said that the Jews were the bitterest in their enmity toward Muslims, the most unrelenting, unforgiving, of those bitterest in their enmity towards Muslims, the most unrelenting, unforgiving of the Jews, and the mushrikin, idolaters in all their forms. It goes on like that. Jamal Badawi has appeared at the very conference, incidentally, at which Mr. Trudeau ultimately did choose to speak. That was, I think, an amazing moment. As I say, I don't know whether I mentioned he prescribes light physical punishment for misbehaving wives, does Badawi publicly, and according to some reports, justifies the practice of polygamy. But I guess a vote is a vote. Things went on like that. As for the NDP, there were concerns a number of years ago when it appeared that the NDP's then federal Quebec lieutenant, one Thomas Mulcair, had not seemed to have been concerned about being present in a room with the then NDP veiled Moroccan-Canadian candidate Dr. Samira Leone, who had recently organized, as part of her connection to the Canadian Islamic Congress, one of the most radical of non-violent organizations, a visit to Canada by British Taliban apologist, as she's often described, Yvonne Ridley. And again, that was disappointing. Tariq Fatah said at a conference in Montreal that I attended, I'm quoting, "But slowly," he was for 17 years a member of the NDP, "I saw the party open its doors to Islamists, first under former NDP leader Alexa McDonough, when supporters of Hamas and Hezbollah managed to join her personal legislative staff, and later under current leader Jack Layton, when the doors were flung open. One Hezbollah supporter even managed to become the Ontario NDP's vice president." Fatah went on, he claimed that he was witness, I quote, to an attempt by a group of wealthy Islamists to back one member of parliament for the leadership with the stated objective of controlling the party, unquotes. He spoke of, quotes, 6 or 7 business people who, quotes, were advised that of all the parties in Canada, the NDP was the easiest to take over and make to serve the Islamist agenda, unquotes. He went on about various things, but he said that, quotes, by 2006, I'd come to the conclusion that the party was up for grabs and noticed a countrywide recruitment in the NDP by pro-Hamas and pro-Hezbollah activists. Today, the NDP is running Islamist candidates, he said, and its discourse is dominated by support of terrorist suspects in the guise of a defense of human rights. This was in 2008, the conference. Well, Fatah may be right or wrong, and I may be right or wrong in a number of things I've said, but I think perhaps the lesson for us all is that we should not kid ourselves any longer in the face of the major demographic shifts we're talking about, the electoral power that will only be growing hugely if things are not brought under rational control, that we can rely upon any recognizable political organization or affinity, no matter how they sweet-talk us in private and elsewhere. And so I would suggest that a partial answer is to go as public as we can, as straightforwardly as we can, consistent with our duty, as I've described earlier, our duty to our children, our grandchildren, and ourselves, and to this country, to make it clear that those who do the right thing will be rewarded. I think in the end, this is, as far as I'm able to discern, a completely amoral and utterly amoral situation we're now living. And so we recognize that this is a purely transactional arrangement, and that if we show those who manage to navigate their ways into power, if we show them that there will be rewards for being good boys and girls and punishments for being bad boys and girls, perhaps we will have some chance of correcting the situation. But as long as we continue to fail so abjectly in our duty, we now know at least where the paving will assuredly lead us. And I thank you so much for your attention.